folks, and welcome back to another episode of the Podcast Digest. It is a big week right here for me on the Podcast Digest. This is episode 64, and I've been sort of telling you folks that I had something special for you guys. When I started the show a little bit over a year ago, it caused me to sort of expand my listening habits and to find new and great shows so that I could bring it to you guys. One of the ones I found early on, right around the beginning of this year, and has been a must-listen for me, is Radio Diaries. I have mentioned it on any number of episodes in the past, and I know I've heard from many of you that it is one of your favorite shows as well, and with good reason. So it is a privilege to welcome the Radio Diaries founder and executive producer, Joe Richman, to the show for episode 64. Just a little bit about Joe and his background. He is an award-winning producer and reporter whose pioneering series, Teenage Diaries, brought the voices of teenagers to a national audience on NPR's All Things Considered. Before he found Radio Diaries, he's been working on NPR programs All Things Considered, Weekend Edition, Car Talk, and Heat. Joe also teaches radio documentary at Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism, which means I'm extremely nervous as well as completely excited to welcome Joe Richman to the Podcast Digest. Welcome, Joe.
Thanks. I'm making you nervous. I love it.
Well, if you are a professor of radio documentary and we're on a podcast, I don't know that I'm going to be able to get a passing grade, but I'm going to try.
Okay, let me just say adjunct professor.
Adjunct.
Whole different world.
We don't need to add that. It sounds impressive regardless, that's for sure. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time to join me here, Joe. And
happy to be here.
Super excited to talk about you and your experience and background as well as the show. But for anybody who, for some strange reason, isn't familiar with your Radio Diaries, can you give folks just kind of a brief personal history and background leading up to the show?
Yeah, I mean, Radio Diaries started doing these diaries actually back in 1996 on NPR, and we're best known for the diaries where we give people tape recorders and work with them to do stories about their lives, from teenagers to people in a retirement home to inmates in a prison. But we also, that's about half what we do. The other half are a lot of historical documentaries and other first-person stories. Our sort of signature is usually we do stories without narration, so stories that are told by the people, in the stories themselves, in their own words.
And how did this idea begin? How back in the 90s, what was your background that led you to decide to start this show?
Well, I started, when I first kind of, when I got out of college, actually, I thought I wanted to do documentary films. That's kind of what I thought I was going to be doing. And I was also doing some radio, working at sort of, doing radio news at a public radio station in Boston. And kind of quickly realized that, and it's even funny to talk about this now that, we're in this, in the podcast world. But back then it was a revelation that you could just go out there with a tape recorder and just do it yourself. It felt so different from documentary film. And I quickly just started, figuring out stories I wanted to do and started interviewing people. And it was just like, oh, I don't need to ask permission. I don't need a ton of money. I could just go out and do it. It's this like passport to do these stories you wanted to do. So I got more and more into radio and then started listening to more radio and realized that there were these things, radio documentaries as well, which I didn't really know about, listening to public radio. And so I kind of got into it through more of the news side and started doing more and more features and sort of longer form stories. And I was kind of a freelance reporter for NPR for a while and a producer for NPR. And then in 96, I started this series, Teenage Diaries, which was modeled on a number of things. There was a wonderful program that aired on NPR called Ghetto Life 101. Dave Isay gave tape recorders to these two teenagers in Chicago. And I talked to Dave when he was working on that, and that was just sort of kind of blew my mind. And other things, I don't know if you've seen the series 28 Up, 21 Up, that whole 7 Up series.
No.
There were Michael Apted in the UK filmed these kids from the age 7, and he followed them every 7 years, and they're up there to their 50s now, maybe even later. And I remember seeing that film, and just a lot of these things came together to form this idea, which became Teenage Diaries, which started out as turn a group of teenagers around the country into reporters covering their own lives. And the original idea was to kind of check in with them periodically, and that kind of became a stupid idea. And the idea ended up as I kind of followed them for close to a year, and at the end of that period produced stories with all their tape that were these portraits of people that were very personal stories, but hopefully said something much larger about, issues, an illegal immigrant, a girl who's coming out to her parents as gay, a kid with Tourette syndrome. It's various issues that, it's kind of a new way to look into some of the stuff that might be on the news every day. And then all of a sudden you have this long documentary about from a teenager that you feel like you get to know that's actually going through it.
It almost seems that, and tell me if you would agree with this connection I'm about to make here, somewhat like an early public radio audio version of what ultimately became reality TV, in the sense that you are shining a light on real life, in this case, teenagers' real lives, that prior to didn't have a lot of exposure. I mean, there were television shows that attempted to do it, but not the actual real thing.
Totally. I mean, this was actually the series started around the time of Real World and those MTV shows way back when, and that was before the real start of reality TV as we know it now. But then it was. I think it sounded very different than the stories do now when they come on the air. But still, I think what makes them different is that so much of the reality stuff out there, of course, sucks. That's the big thing. It just sucks, and it's not really. They aren't real stories, and so I think that there is so much of this kind of thing today, but not the real version of this kind of thing.
And especially when you had the idea to sort of go to real people and start getting their input, their stories, why teenagers? Why not adults or older folks? I know you've expanded over the years, but why did it start with teens?
I'm not sure why I decided then. I can tell you now why it works so well with teenagers.
Right.
I mean, we did this diary in a retirement home many years ago, and we couldn't do it as a full diary. I had to supplement with interviews. And it wasn't, the technology was part of it. It's easier for teens to pick up the technology, of course, than grown-ups or even elderly folks in a retirement home. But more than that, these folks in the retirement home just needed to be asked. They were too kind of humble and modest to just talk in a real reflective and honest way without being prompted and asked and, in a sense, invited. Teenagers don't have that problem. Teenagers, they kind of feel like everything they say is important, and that's useful. I think there's just less of a filter, less of a sense of, there's more hubris, and so that's one of the reasons. The other reason that it works so well is that teenagers have a lot of time. I mean, that's really a big reason. They're they're game, they have a lot of time, and, just to it's play, it's fun for them. And then, of course, maybe the most important reason, this is probably the reason we started with teenagers in the first place, was that they're going through something. And that's really what these stories are. That's really the point of giving someone a tape recorder over a long period of time, is that you can watch something change. You can watch a story happen. You can track it. You can watch transformation. And teenagers are figuring themselves out and figuring the world out. And so you get a little window into that.
So what were those early days like? How did you find the subjects, and what was it like when you started to get some of this tape back?
Yeah, I mean, some of originally the stories, they came in different ways. I mean, sometimes a particular person might be recommended to me. Usually what we did is we were looking for a type of a story. I mentioned the undocumented immigrant. That's an example of, as a reporter for NPR, I might have done a story about an undocumented immigrant, and I would have tried to find someone in much the same way that I would try to find a diarist. I'd be choosing a place and calling everyone, and one call would lead to another call, to another call, to another call, until I found a good character. And that's sort of the way it worked for the diarist too. I was looking for someone who had come over the border pretty recently, whose English was good enough, who I just kind of connected with, really, who I felt I could work with. And I found this kid named Juan, who I flew down to Laredo, Texas, where he was, and we started working together, and we did a story about, having come over illegally over the border. And then Juan was one of the diarists that I also worked with many years later to do an adult diary, sort of looking back on his teenage years and his situation now. He's an interesting story even today because he's this kind of like middle-class success story of, he's got this great family and wife and 2 cars and he's good job, and he's just a total American success story, except for the fact that he's still undocumented after now it's 20 years.
Wow. And I want to talk a little bit about the Revisited series that you've done in sort of the podcast format here recently or earlier this year. But before we get to that, I'm curious, still back on those early days. So you identify these first few folks, and then they eventually turn in their tape recorders, or you start getting the tapes. At what point did you realize that there's something really here? I can cut this up and make something amazing.
Yeah, I kind of felt that pretty early on, but I would say that the thing that was the first revelation was like the most amazing scenes that were coming back were just conversations, conversations between teens and their parents, sometimes between, them and friends. But these conversations were like these real glimpses, these real intimate glimpses. But, the other thing that was happening, and this is one of the things that was so different, giving someone a tape recorder versus me being there with a tape recorder, is it just opens it up for kind of the unexpected stuff, surprises. I mean, there would be part of the process is I get tapes back and I'm listening to the tapes and I'm able to respond pretty quickly, so that they know that it's they're sort of recording for someone. They know there's someone there listening, and I'm able to sort of figure out if there are problems, and most importantly, be able to say, "Oh, this is an interesting part of the story that I would never have expected or thought about or thought to ask." If I was sitting there interviewing, so it's that stuff that kind of comes up naturally that you wouldn't think to go for. That is, it's the stuff you don't get in other ways, and is also usually the real, surprising meat of the story.
And all of this debuted back, what was it, mostly 95, 96, the original Teenage Diaries? Yeah,
the original Teenage Diaries series started in 1996, and then kind of it went on for, sort of a decade after that, and I suppose even till now. We're working on a story that has really come out of the Teenage Diaries series even now, with a girl in Saudi Arabia who we met through kind of an online contest, and she's doing a story about being a young girl in Saudi Arabia and being kind of pushed into marriage and kind of, gender issues there. So, in a sense, this Teenage Diaries series has been continuing for 20 years as we keep doing diaries, and we often focus on teenagers.
And early on, they were featured mostly on All Things Considered, and a little bit on This American Life. Is that correct?
Right. Yeah. Usually, those stories aired on All Things Considered. We do other stories on This American Life as well, and sometimes BBC and other places. But the Teenage Diaries and other diaries tended to live on All Things Considered. And I guess you were going to ask about the podcast then, or am I anticipating the question?
Yeah, I was going to say, so you've done this a little bit. So exactly. So they were segments on these wonderful shows on public radio, and then how do we end up being its own podcast?
Yeah, I mean, well, it's funny. We actually, I feel like Radio Diaries has had 2 lives as a podcast, because we actually started a podcast quite a long time ago, back sort of when podcasting was beginning. We've been there from the beginning, but we were doing it really stupidly, really. We just kind of had the stories that would air on NPR, and we just put them out on the podcast and wouldn't touch anything, wouldn't make it, sometimes use the exact same host intros, use Robert Siegel's intro or whatever, and then a little bit later on I was just reading the same words that Robert Siegel would read. So it was kind of just it was like a cut and paste job, and it was and it wasn't really thinking about what makes sense for a podcast. So it was about 2 years ago, a little bit before we joined Radiotopia, that and podcasts were starting to really kind of bubble up more, and we just thought, oh, this isn't just like putting the story on the website. This is something different, and we started to think about how to make these stories that we do into something that feels like a show. Really think about what is the essay that leads into it. If we're taking an old story, how do we make it fresh and new? Do we go back and we interview someone that we had done a story with long ago? We go back to some outtakes or some behind-the-scenes stories. How do we take a piece of an old story and turn that into a new story? And, of course, how do we do new stories? So it's just been the last 2 years that we've been thinking of ourselves not as a radio series that just happens to then, also be distributed on a podcast, but to think about having a show that is a podcast as well.
And that was something I was getting to as well, which is, was it when the podcast, the second iteration, became more of a thing that we moved away from we've talked a lot about sort of the Teenage Diaries component, but you have done all kinds of other subject matters. And I know you mentioned you've done some other things for This American Life. I'm kind of curious from a Radio Diaries standpoint, as you guys evolved into these other topic matters, how did that process happen? Did it was just this desire to get other perspectives, other end of the spectrum?
Part of it is just organically. I mean, I'm kind of a history nut, and I love old archival recordings. I'm a total archival tape geek, and so I've always done history stories. Always been interested in it, and also it has to do with the diaries are really hard. They take a lot of time, and they're hard to produce, and they're kind of draining sometimes emotionally, and I knew from the beginning I didn't want to do just that. So we kind of almost bounce back and forth, or we do about half and half, these kind of historical documentaries and diaries, and what we call portraits as well, that are sort of like the diaries, but we're not really handing over the tape recorder. So we kind of different styles, and then sometimes more just reported stories that I would narrate through, which is what we tend to do on This American Life sometimes. So it's a mix, but I would say there is a sensibility and a spirit and kind of a mission to all of our work that's true for everything that we do, and it mostly has to do with. Partly it has to do with taking advantage of what's good about radio, which is, great characters, intimate stories. We try to do stories that feel like, it reduces the distance between the subject and the listener as much as possible is really what we do. And so sometimes that means taking out the narrator, taking out me, taking out that middleman. And sometimes it has to do with just really looking for scenes and tape that, lets the listener experience the story as much, as much as possible as it is to do that. So that, because that's the kind of story that I like. I don't want to be told. I want to kind of really experience it for myself. Those are the stories that I like, and that's what we try to do.
And that's what I wanted to shed some light on, are some of these other sort of entrees into different stylistic types of episodes, and the portraits and the histories sort of do that. We're going to talk about a few specific episodes that are out there for folks to go ahead and subscribe to and go back and find some of these particular episodes. But folks, I would recommend any of Radio Diaries' back catalog at this point, and probably even well beyond what exists as a podcast entry. But before we get into those, I do want to talk a little bit about some of those portraits in those histories, specifically those histories, because correct me if I'm wrong here, Joe, the history style podcasts are some of the most ambitious, involved work that you guys have done so far, correct?
Some of them, certainly. I mean, we did this, probably the biggest project we've done is this whole history of Nelson Mandela and the history of apartheid. I lived in South Africa for a couple of years, so I was working on that project at the time, and that was probably a year and a half long project, and it's not the kind of thing you can do for a biweekly podcast. But the history stuff can be really involved. It's a lot of real research and journalism. It's the archival materials. It's finding the right characters. But I love it. I mean, I think in some ways the diaries our diaries are in a way, in a sense, maybe more special, or they kind of, it's sort of what I can do, what we can do best in a sense. But the history I just love. I love to do. I love the kind of built-in narratives, and I love the archival materials, and I love history stories that are kind of hidden and that people don't know much about, and to be able to, especially when you can find characters that have some real connection to it, you know, a granddaughter or someone or a eyewitness or someone who like was really affected in some way, and do the detective work of figuring something out. That just really makes the history come alive.
And it adds variety, if you will, to the subscription, right? When folks end up seeing a new episode arriving of Radio Diaries, they could end up having any one of these episode types, if you will, and they could be fulfilling or entertaining in very different ways. I remember I literally learned so much from the episode, and I believe that you guys had filed this under your History's top label on the strange fruit, which was mind-blowing to me. And it actually, I've said many times on previous episodes, Joe, that a great podcast is one that causes you to take action. That action could be as simple as a Google search and going down sort of the rabbit hole of figuring out this piece of information that you didn't know anything about, and almost ashamed to say I wasn't familiar with the song or the history. But from your episode, I went digging and was amazed when I saw the picture and heard the story of the song and so on and so forth. And it was an extraordinarily powerful episode.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great example of, you know, a lot of people do know the history of the Billie Holiday song "Strange Fruit," that it was, you know, it was written by this guy who was affected by this lynching in Marion, Indiana. So there's this layer there. But most people don't know that in that lynching, the two boys who were lynched, that there was a third boy who was supposed to be lynched, who was actually brought up to the tree and was going to be lynched and survived, he's now considered, James Cameron was considered the only African-American to ever survive a lynching. So I love that there are these kind of like, kind of smaller, the telescope gets smaller and smaller as you dig into that story. But what's interesting to me about that one, and this is one of the things that just completely made me fall for podcasts and for art, you know, for doing the podcast in the first place, is that story aired on NPR a bunch of years ago, and we freshened it up. We kind of did an updated version at the time of the Ferguson incident, you know, over a year ago now, and put it out on the podcast then. And then it just, all of a sudden, it was part of this national conversation, and it got picked up a lot, and it kind of went, it really got spread around a lot. But it all of a sudden had this whole different frame, this whole different context because of what was happening in the world. And I love that you can take something old or do something new and sort of respond in some way to, you know, the conversation that's happening out there. And, you know, it doesn't have to be literal. It doesn't have to be too nail on the head. It's this history story, and it just somehow it reverberates in new ways, and I love that.
Well, and I think that's so much about what Radio Diaries is about, and Liz, for me to tell you, but it seems like relevancy and impact and meaning are so front and center and thematically in terms of a lot of the stories you guys, you know, tease out from the diaries or the historical stories, is that there is applicability, there is value, there is still lessons to be taken from this one person's story or this historical event or what have you. And I think that's one of the reasons for its resonance, at least for me personally anyways.
I'm glad. I wanted to ask you just said earlier about you never know what you're going to get, you know, the history of the diaries. And I'm curious, because it's something I think about like, it, you know, there's a value to having something consistent, to knowing what you're getting. And that's not true with our podcast. I wonder, you know, and I'm curious, you know, I'd like to hear from our listeners more about what are the pros and cons of like getting things that, you know, you don't know quite what you're going to get, that they're going to sound really different from episode to episode.
Well, and folks, there's your call to action. let Joe know what you think about that. But for what it's worth, as a listener, I can tell you legitimately, It is. There's a consistency, yes. And to be honest with you, it's something that I struggle with my own show, that one of the reasons that I try to change up things a little bit, whether it be, a smaller independent show or a larger nationally recognized show or a recommendations episode that I do, is to make sure there is a certain amount of variety within what I deliver in the feed each week. I think personally that's a benefit. And as somebody who has a current active subscription list of 101 shows, I think there is value in a certain amount of discovery or anticipation or surprise that happens when you either read the show notes or read the title and hit play and see what you get. I think that if you stay in the same lane too long, too often, there is a chance for somebody to look at the new episode arrival and think, well, I know what that is, and kind of scroll it down on the up next list because they think they know. So I think maintaining a little bit of that variety or surprise is important. Again, folks, that's just my opinion. If you guys feel different, let Joe know.
I guess we're all getting all podcast philosophy here, but I mean, I guess that is one of the things that make podcasts unique, is that, we all get to be our own program directors, editors, decision makers. So it's like, well, what would I want to hear? So that's sort of all. It all comes down to that in the end.
Absolutely, and I think I completely agree with you. That is one of the things that makes podcast listening such a wonderful thing. Speaking of podcast listening, I've heard a few things in your own back catalog that I've truly loved, and you were kind enough to share some bits and pieces of those so that we can let folks get an idea of what they're looking for. And we wanted to highlight a couple of particular episodes, some that we've sort of talked about a little bit, but I want to talk a little bit more about one of the ones that I brought up to you when we were having this conversation that sort of literally blew my mind. We talked about expanding sort of beyond, the teenage diaries early into these other formats and approaches. And one of the things that you guys have been doing has been sort of the same concept of handing the recorder to somebody, but this time that recorder's been going into prisons and in different sides of the prisons, be it an inmate or a guard. But on the inmate side, one of the ones that you guys featured was back on episode 33 entitled Bullets and Balance Sheets. And this was a really interesting story, and we've got a little bit of audio on that. But before I play it, can you sort of set the stage for folks on what this episode's about and why I love it?
Yeah, well, you'll have to tell me why you love it. But I'll tell you why I love it. It's just sort of the backstory that no one would know about, which is that this actually came out of I was doing a story for This American Life about this program in Richman, California, that is essentially paying people who are at risk, who have been committing some crimes and are in danger of going to prison, paying them to give up crime. That's the kind of the simplified way to talk about it. But we kind of profiled one of the caseworkers and a couple of the guys in the program to do a story about, it's a pretty adventurous program, pretty controversial program to reward criminals for good behavior, in a sense, the opposite of what we tend to do. So in reporting that story, I met this other guy who didn't make it into this American Life story, but who had just such an amazing story on his own, didn't quite fit into the one, the other one that we were telling. And so one of the reasons I love it is because this is exactly what is so darn good about having a podcast is 5 years ago, that would have just, his story would have just ended up in the trash can. And I was able to do something that didn't make it into the broadcast, but really deserved to be something in its own right. And that's what we did.
And the story is of an inmate, Kamari, is it Ridgel?
Kamari Ridgel, yeah. Not an inmate anymore. He was, he, at this point when I met him, he was, he'd basically given up a life of crime, as you'll hear, and was transitioning to a very different life. But he had been, I'm not sure where you're picking up the tape, but he had been shot 23 times in a gang shooting and survived. He's in a wheelchair, but he still has, I think, 4, maybe 5 bullets still in his body. But just that fact alone, of course, made me want to interview him, like being shot in one incident 22 times.
So let's talk a little bit. Let's hear a little bit from Kamari, and then we'll come back and talk a little bit more about this episode.
Do you think in this period, did you kill anyone?
Nah.
You shoot anyone?
Could have shot somebody. I don't know. It was so many of us doing these shootings that it was just like, whoever gonna claim it, let them claim it. But me, I'm keeping mine that I don't know. That's my answer.
So that's just a little tiny piece of what was featured in your conversations with Kamari. Well, I guess it wasn't yours. It was that was recorded for this episode, and he sort of turned things around with what he was doing in the future with his sort of intellect.
Yeah, I mean, just a quick background too. I mean, one of the things that he got known for early on, at the age, I believe it was 14, he went into his middle school, or maybe it was high school, maybe it was 13. I can't remember the numbers now, but with an assault rifle, and luckily he didn't use it, but he was arrested and sent to a juvenile facility for showing up at a middle school with an assault weapon. I mean, it's just crazy. So, yeah. Richmond, California at that time, and still now, big gang problems, big kind of turf problems, and he was caught up in that. And as I said, he ended up being shot 22 times. And that, as much as anything, of course, changed his life in the sense that he was now in a wheelchair, wasn't going to be out in the street in quite the same way, and gave him an opportunity to think about doing something different. And luckily he got hooked up with this program that I mentioned that we did the This American Life story about. And now he's studying to be an accountant. And what he talks about, which is sometimes a cliche in these sort of stories, but with him it's so real too. He just loves I asked him, like, it just seems like there couldn't be anything more different from being like, gang shootings and QuickBooks, but he loves it. Because it's just like, he says it's exactly what he was doing selling drugs. He gets it. He gets the expenses and the revenue and the numbers and if you bring these expenses down, you can bring this revenue up here. And he's fallen in love with the math and the science and the kind of, that part of accounting. And so luckily he's found something that has kind of, brought him to, to a way of life that can, he could do something that's legit.
And folks, it's an amazing story. You have to listen to this. This is episode 33, I believe, in the Radio Diaries feed. This person ends up being almost revered. I think I recall guards were asking him for financial advice, and he's kind of really sort of turned it around in terms of what sort of occupies his mind nowadays versus sort of how he ended up in there.
Yeah, he is. I mean, it's you can always tell when the caseworkers who worked with Kamari really like him, and I think that's the best way to tell of whether it's prison guards or in this case the caseworker outside of prison, they're just fond of certain guys no matter what, how bad they were sort of, coming up. And Kamari is one of those guys that the people who are working with him are really rooting for him, and that says something.
Yeah, great episode, folks. Definitely one of my favorites for sure. One of the ones when Joe and I started talking that I really wanted to highlight because it was so impressive. One of the ones we've been talking about a little bit has been that Teenage Diaries series. That there has been a revisiting, if you will. Joe alluded to it earlier, where these 15, 16, 20 years, what have you, where you put recorders back in someone's hand. And I want to talk a little bit about one of those episodes. And it was funny, I recently re-listened to it in preparation for our conversation, Joe, and I understand that the one we're going to talk about right now, Melissa, was actually one that you had lost contact for a long time.
Yeah, I mean, Melissa was one of the early teenage diarists, so I kind of worked with her back in 90, in the mid-90s, 96, 97. Her story was she had just had an incredibly hard life, abandoned when she was 2, so in and out of foster care and group homes and that sort of thing for most of her life. And then was officially emancipated at the age of 15, so given custody of herself at the age of 15 and living on her own. This was in New Haven, Connecticut at the time. And then she got pregnant at the age of 18. So that's when I met her through her social worker to do a story about being a teenager who didn't have a family, who was about to start a family and have this kid at the age of 18. So we did a diary that aired on NPR about having this baby. And I kept up with Melissa. She did one more story about a year later when her son Isaiah was 1. And then she completely disappeared. I mean, not just from my life, but from, her caseworker, from her friends in New Haven. She really kind of vanished. And, over the years, I try to keep up with as many of the diarists as I can, but Melissa, I, totally lost touch with. And then it was about 15 years later that I got an email from her out of the blue. She had Googled her name and seen her story on our website or the NPR website. And she emailed me and said, I don't know if you remember me, but, I just wanted to let you know I turned out okay. And I got back in touch with her and, learned about what she had been through. And, part of that is in her new story with some, serious stuff that happened with the health of her son. And so we started talking about doing a news story as, 16 years later as an adult now in her 30s. And that led to a whole series called Teenage Diaries Revisited, where we went back to 5 of the original teenagers and who are now in their 30s and did, grown-up diaries with them. But Melissa was the one who kind of led to that, just kind of reconnect with her after all those years. And, the amazing thing about her story is that this little baby who was almost born on the radio. I mean, she brought the tape recorder into the hospital when she was having him and recorded. That's a scene in her original teenage story. That baby is 16 years old when she does her next story. And, that's part of the story, is having a conversation with him.
Yep, and that is what I want to have people listen to right now. We've got a little piece of audio from I guess was the original episode back in the 90s when Melissa had Isaiah. And then I'm going to follow that up immediately with a conversation that she had with Isaiah in the Revisited episode, which is episode number 3 from the Radio Diaries podcast.
And I'll just tell you, if you want to know what makes a good diarist, actually bringing the tape recorder into the hospital when you're about to give birth, that's one criteria.
It's a level of commitment that's unequal. Exactly. That's for sure. And doesn't she say that, I believe, in the Revisited episode or the original, that, hey, I actually brought it into, or something to that effect?
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah. But let's take a listen, folks.
Yeah. Judy, hi. Judy, report on line 1, Judy.
Today is October the 9th. And I have a brand new baby boy, 7 pounds. His name is Isaiah Seto. And he was born at 1:30, right? 1:30, right?
1:17.
1:17, exactly.
He was born an hour ago. I was watching 1:17.
And we would have recorded the birth, but it happened so fast.
About half an hour.
So I'm sorry you couldn't hear all the pain, but it was easy.
He's so adorable.
I can't believe this whole thing was inside of me.
Congratulations, Missy.
Thank you. I can't believe this whole thing was inside of me.
It's funny to you?
Yes. It was hard.
It was hard. You were an extreme change in my life. A lot of people didn't want me to have you. People tried to talk me out of it. Said that I wasn't going to be a good mother. And I said I was going to love my baby no matter what. Love him more than anybody ever loved me. Understand that?
Yes.
Kind of mushy. What else?
How your life be different if you didn't have me?
Well, if I didn't have you, I could say I was lonely before you was born. And you was born, it was almost like I wasn't lonely anymore. So no matter how bad things got, I knew I always had you. I felt bad about your father. I felt like it was my fault that I chose the wrong person to be your father. I tried to replace him with other men to be your father. But I knew at the end you were just mine, and I was fine with that. I was just hoping that you would be fine with that. Are you fine with that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Dun 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 dun.
What's that noise from?
It's like when you play a game, they say dun 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 dun. Goodbye.
Da-da-da-da. Game over. Love that grin. Let me stop it.
Yes.
So, Joe, what do you think when you hear that before and after kind of put back to back like that, especially through the context of sort of the role you had in that?
God, it's a great question because I don't think I've heard. I loved hearing it just now. The old tape of the hospital going right into the conversation with Isaiah. I like the kind of that transition. It's like. I mean, the original Teenage Diaries series, part of the goal was to let people have tape recorders long enough that things happened. Like the microphone could record some things happening in their lives, and you could just feel like you were along for the ride. And so this is just a 16-year version of that. I mean, for me, the Revisited series was, a very, very personal project because these are people that some of them I remained very close with over the years. Some I had lost touch with, but they were now the age in their 30s that I was when I first started working with them. And so, I've gone 16 years myself and things have changed in my life and their lives. And, some of them had drastic changes in their lives. The All-American football star from Alabama who got involved with crystal meth and, just things happen in people's lives. And so it was, I like the stories that came out of that series, but it was also just behind the scenes for me. It was like a real, like kind of life education kind of project. Real life, stuff happens.
And I think there's probably, and I've said this before on previous episodes, but the type of work that you're doing with Radio Diaries, especially when it's the topic matter that Melissa's before and after, the original and the revisited episodes cover, is that there are so many people out there, mothers or kids of young mothers, single mothers, that can probably listen to this and get a relatability and sense of, I'm not alone, and there are other people dealing with what I've dealt with, that it almost ends up being this, altruistic community service that contains so much more value than just, that was a great episode, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly, these stories are so personal and about one person's life, but I think they're successful when they don't feel like one person's life. They feel like, oh, I know that person. That person is partly me. It's partly my aunt, my friend, my sister, I think one thing about Melissa's story, if listeners go back to hear her revisited story, her adult story, she, at the time she was working in a call center. So she was doing that, she was that woman that you talked to when you were pissed off about your cable bill. That was her. Melissa was on the other end of the line, and we all know that phone call and that person and that frustration and whatever else. And so even on that level, in that one little scene, I love how it humanized the person on the other end of that, what is such an anonymous kind of interaction for most of us. And I think that's kind of like what these stories can do. They can take, a cliche, a stereotype that we may have about an undocumented immigrant or a teen mom or a this or a that, the other, and turn them into, our neighbor, our family member, the person who's down the street that we know, just someone who we feel like someone who's three-dimensional and a human being. And I think that's, I certainly don't think of these stories as activism, except for in that. It's sort of like taking stigmas and kind of two-dimensional, feelings about an issue and busting them open and feeling like, oh no, these are real people.
Yeah, humanizing a story or a perspective that you don't hear very often is pretty much what the most recent episode has done with the Prison Diaries series, or Diaries from Prison Guards, if you will. It's called Serving 9 to 5. It's episode 40. That is sort of, again, the tape recorder with the individual, but this time you went to prison guards. Tell us a little bit about this sort of series or idea, or how this has all come together.
Yeah, so this one was, the foundation of it is from an old series that we did on NPR, Prison Diaries, where we gave tape recorders to. We got pretty amazing access to two different facilities: a juvenile facility in Rhode Island and a youth prison in North Carolina, and we're able to give tape recorders to a group of inmates in both those facilities for a period of about 6 months. And this episode is about, along the way of doing that, I started to realize that I was kind of ignoring the stories of the guards, which were, really interesting. I mean, so many of them said something along the lines of, I was that kid on the other side of the bars, but, I got a break, or I went into the Army, or something happened that I end up as a guard while they end up as an inmate. I mean, a lot of them related to these guys, even though there was, a lot of animosity sometimes and aggression and the things you might expect. A bunch of the guards really saw themselves in the inmates too, which I was surprised at. So along the way of doing these inmate stories, decided to interview and give tape recorders to a group of guards as well, and combine all of their stories into one documentary that became this guard diary story. And that's our most recent episode of the podcast. We kind of started that episode, framed it with an essay about what many of your listeners may know, the Stanford prison experiment, this kind of famous and controversial experiment where some students were some turned into guards and some turned into inmates, and were supposed to enact those roles, and quickly took on those roles to kind of a frightening extent, to where the guards were really being, turned into oppressors in a way that surprised the, everyone involved with the experiment. And it stopped the experiment early. So, it kind of set up the story with that notion of like, what happens, just when you put on the uniform, what does that change? And, one of the things I talked about is in the experiment, the way that they chose who was going to be a guard and who was going to be inmate was just to flip a coin. It was just that simple, which I love. And so it reminded me of the guard story, where that's exactly what some of the guards said. Like, but for a flip a coin, I could have been on the other end of the bars.
And we hear from several gentlemen and prison guards that are telling you parts of their lives and jobs and what it's like to go to work every day at a job like that I hadn't heard before. And I've got a little sample here from one of those gentlemen. Let's go ahead and let folks hear that now.
See, I wear this uniform with pride. Every day that I come in here, I'm creased down. My shoes are signed, and I smell good. The uniform is 90% of the job. 90% of the respect that you're going to get from your clientele. How can you tell the inmate to brush his teeth and to keep his hygiene up when yours ain't? So that's 90% of the job. Looking the part.
I smell good.
Yeah. It's such an interesting perspective. Something I don't think anyone ever would have thought that was, so important.
Yeah, I mean, that's, it is. It's about the uniform. I mean, that's, he says it all right there. And, the interesting thing about that's Sergeant Furman Camel, who he saw that prison being built. He was there, in that area, saw the prison being built, and he was one of the first people to work in there. And he ended up working in that prison for 27 years, which I think I say in the opening of the podcast is as long as Mandela spent in prison, right. Except for, Camel did it in 8-hour shifts.
And was he the gentleman that was about to retire / quit, or was that someone else?
That's him, yeah.
That's exactly. Him, yeah. My last day is this Friday. Or something.
No. Sorry. He is the guy that we leave the prison with at the end. But no. Taz Baskerville is the guy who's retiring, and actually not retiring. He was quitting, and he was a really interesting guy because he was the one of all the guards I talked to that was most disturbed by just being a prison guard. You know, he's the one who talks about looking up and seeing all these black faces, all these young men, and he probably is the one who most saw himself in those young men. And so I think where Camel was actually, he was getting ready to retire around the time that I met him, but it was Taz Baskerville who quit, I think just because he had problems with doing that job.
Yeah, I think he was the one who said that my wife learned that, you know, when I first come home that, you know, you may not want to deal with me and that type of impact.
Yeah. I mean, it without a doubt, I mean, there are, you know, tons of studies about the effects that being a prison guard has on people and on marriages specifically. So, yeah, it's a real thing.
It was a great episode, and that whole prison series, if you will, and I think what you were alluding to earlier was what I kind of wanted to bring up now and call to folks' attention. One of the things that probably is not only my favorite episode of Radio Diaries, but maybe one of my favorite podcasts I've heard in 2015 was an episode called Matthew and the Judge. And folks, this is one of the ones that I don't want to go through or play a clip for you or summarize it for you in any way, other than to say, go back and listen to this, especially if you're a parent or you are a teenager listening to this. It's episode 35. And this was one that I literally, and I think this has only happened with this episode, maybe one other, sent it to my wife, sent it to both my kids still in home, and said, listen to this today. And they did, because I felt like it was that type of moving, impactful, important, and just eye-opening. So I wanted to share that with you first, Joe.
Wow, yeah.
And then as well.
And why? Tell me, why did that one get you so much?
So, in our family, we've got 3 kids. One is adult and out of the house, and then a middle one, 2 older boys. And both of the boys had their time phase with misbehaviors. Nothing too overly drastic, but enough to warrant concern. And as a parent, I think that you are always attempting to tell your kids, you know, if you keep on this road, this is what can happen. And often for kids, it's so hard for them to realize or understand that reality because it seems so agnostic and so, you know, on TV and, oh, yeah, sure, Dad, and that type of thing. And there was something about the way this story was put together with the before, the during, and the after. That in that the length of that episode, which wasn't overly long for anyone concerned with, drives those points home that in a way that I think all of us as parents have been trying to do forever for their kids.
Interesting, yeah. I mean, I just to explain for people who don't know the story, it's a 2-part diary or 2-character diary. One with Matthew Amasori, who is this juvenile, you know, getting in trouble with drugs in and out of this juvenile facility again and again, and also a diary with the judge who he kept going before, who had to keep deciding whether to give him a second chance, a third chance. So it's sort of about that. And, the thing that affected me so much about the story, I hope it comes through, and, you know, I still think about this one, is that, you know, Matthew was this kid that all the guards, they didn't call them guards at the juvenile facility, I'm forgetting what they called them, but they were pulling for him. You know, he taught them how to play chess. He was a smart guy, funny, really good looking, like had everything going for him, except for he just kept getting in trouble, and the judge kept wanting to give him more chances, and, you know, the people inside the facility kept pulling for him. But he kept ending back behind bars again and again and again. And I don't want to give too much away, but, you know, in the end, it just didn't go well.
There's what I call required listening Joe, and anybody who has the podcast app on their phone, and today as we record this, we're recording this on October 27th, Google Play Music is now about to start carrying podcasts. So now nobody has an excuse. if you start listening to podcasts, take that episode of Radio Diaries and just listen to it. And it won't only do so much for you as a listener, as a parent, but just for the medium as a whole. I think it speaks to all the wonderful things that can come out of what Radio Diaries is doing, what Joe has done his whole career, but what so many shows are pulling forward. And part of that group of people who are doing that work is the collective that you're a part of, which is Radiotopia. Tell folks how Radio Diaries became part of Radiotopia, Joe.
Yeah, and I'll say, if listeners do check out that episode, and you feel free to get in touch with us, tweet at us, review us, all that stuff. We'd love to hear from you and hear what you think. But Radiotopia, we were a founding member of Radiotopia. This is back a year and a half ago. I guess it'll be 2 years in February that Radiotopia was formed. And the idea was just, to put together, if listeners know Radiotopia at all, it's kind of this mismatched, odd band of kind of like a weird indie label of podcasts. The podcasts are very different, a lot of them, but there is this spirit, I think, to all of them, which is, entrepreneurial, independent, creative, definitely kind of story-driven narrative podcast for the most part. And the idea, through the Public Radio Exchange is get together and form a network of these podcasts where we all, run and own our own shows. But we come together to support each other, promote each other. There's strength in that kind of camaraderie. And it's been great, as podcasts have exploded. There's more and more out there. Now that people either there is money or people think there's money there, it's like everyone's jumping in. So, it's harder and harder to get an audience, to reach people. And I think there's value in, really what we're doing right now on your podcast is letting people know about podcasts that we all like. That's just really, that's the way people hear about it, and that's important. And that's a way to kind of get above, whatever marketing the bigger guys may have. So it's been great, and I love all the shows in Radiotopia, and it's been a great experience. And we're in the middle of a fundraiser right now. So if you like Radiotopia, you can check out radiotopia.fm and see all the shows. And if you feel so inclined, you can contribute to helping us all keep it going.
Yeah, Radiotopia is the home of so many of my favorite shows, and I imagine a lot of people listening as well. I don't know of a group where you can literally almost click on any member of the group there and find something that will certainly open your eyes and your ears, if nothing else. It might not be up your alley, but I guarantee you at least a couple of them will be. And Radiotopia has always been very good to me, and several of their hosts have joined me for conversation. And just, Joe, you're in that group. Just great hosts and people bringing wonderful things into our ears every week or every couple of weeks. So definitely suggest folks to check out that website. And of course, all those links, as all the ones we've been talking about, will be in the show notes as well. As we wind up, Joe, I wanted to bring up just a couple of sort of broader topics, maybe not necessarily specifically with Radio Diaries, but just sort of your opinion as somebody who's been doing this a long time. You mentioned it a little bit already, and the medium itself, podcasting, has really sort of been taking off, if you will. Some people will say it was serial, or it hasn't been. It's been a steady growth all along. But if nothing else, it seems to me that there is an injection recently of higher quality, of higher frequency, of more shows doing more great things. What are your thoughts of the medium as a whole, where you think it's going, and sort of where you see yourself and Radio Diaries' role in the future?
Yeah, I mean, without a doubt, podcasts, not only have been exploding in terms of number of podcasts and number of listeners, but yeah, the quality is just getting so much better. There's so many, where I sit, whether it's podcasts or radio, there's so much just interest in doing good stories, narrative stories or other kinds of stories. And that's exciting. There's just like this real kind of creative energy happening out there, which, hasn't always been the case. And so that alone is exciting. I kind of feel two opposite things in the sense. On one hand, I feel like this distinction between radio and podcast is a little bit false. I think there's, first of all, a lot of the big podcasts are on radio as well, but that good audio storytelling is good audio storytelling, and something that's just this bubble of talking about podcasts that seems a little bit like just kind of a made up thing. On the other hand, a complete opposite. I feel that there is something really different about the medium too. I mean, it is even more of a sort of one-to-one communication than broadcast is, and certainly this feeling like, we're all our own radio stations, we're all our own producer and distributor and editor, gives you this kind of creative energy and freedom that, of course, couldn't exist when you actually need a radio station and a radio program. So there's a lot of stuff happening, and obviously just, the fact that it's piping right into people's ears for the most part, as opposed to a radio and a speaker. There are a lot of things that make it different. It's exciting. I mean, for us, what the most exciting thing is that we're able, for almost 20 years now, I've been producing stories mostly for NPR. And on one hand, the thing I love most about that is that these weird stories we do are right up against the news from Syria and the news about the presidential election. And I like that kind of, I like that pairing. I like that you're reaching people that didn't want to find you, didn't know about you, didn't want to hear a story about, this kid in prison. On the other hand, there's something so great about having a community that is really looking for you and finding you and is really listening more closely and intently, and is, you're talking directly to them. So both things I value. I kind of wouldn't want to do just one, to tell you the truth.
And folks, if you're interested in hearing more about sort of NPR and radio storytelling, not to highlight another episode, but just to go back, episode 39, the one recently prior to the current one as we record, the man who put the P in NPR was a conversation you had with Bill Siemering, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly.
That's right, yeah.
Which was excellent. What a great conversation that was.
Yeah, that was, again, that was like what I love about the podcast is it was such a departure for us. It was completely different from any episode that we've done before. But I love Bill Siemering. I think that original mission statement for NPR that he wrote back in 1969-70 is such a beautiful document. And it's like, what the hell? Let's put it in the podcast. Why not?
Yeah, and that goes to what I was talking about earlier, Joe, with the concept of, like you said, a departure. When I saw that come in my feed, I was like, this is different for Radio Diaries, but so intriguing and interesting. And again, something that I probably never would have heard myself if you guys had said, that doesn't fit with what we do with Radio Diaries, so we're not going to put this out. But because you guys chose to, I think you exposed him, that message, and sort of the legacy purpose, if you will, of public radio that is probably forgotten by at least a lot of us younger listeners who are more podcasty than radio.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I'm glad. I'm feeling like encouraged to just like not worry about like keeping consistent. So we'll keep throwing some weird ones out there now and again.
Oh, geez, if you get negative feedback about that in the future, don't blame it on me. Or blame it on me. I'm the little guy. That's fine. Well, I want to be respectful of your time, Joe, but I definitely want people to know where to find all about Radio Diaries or yourself and all the work that you're doing. So if you could give them a quick rundown of where to find you in the show.
Yeah, well, obviously you can find our podcast. Where to find our podcast if you're listening to this podcast on iTunes or wherever else, or through Radiotopia. And you can tweet at us at Radio Diaries, and our website is radiodiaries.org. And, if you're interested in learning more about the work we do and finding out about news stories, you can go to the website and join our newsletter. We send out an occasional newsletter. And I don't know, the most important thing is just listen. I mean, listen to us, listen to the other Radiotopia shows. And I'm sure if you're listening to this podcast, you're listening to a lot of other favorites. So, I mean, that's the amazing thing. It's like there's so much good stuff out there right now. I mean, that's really where we're at, which is exciting.
Yeah. One of the people I follow on Twitter, right as we were hopping on the recording, Joe, said on Twitter, just downloaded 198 episodes for my upcoming 5-hour flight.
Oh, God.
And I said, well, I think that might be enough. It might be. And he said, well, no, I'll make it 200. But it's great to see people kind of looking at it that way, that here's an opportunity to plow through a bunch of listening. And as somebody with earbuds in their ears, probably 12 to 14 hours a day, I'm looking forward to what's coming up from Radio Diaries, from you, and from Radiotopia as a whole, as a huge fan. So
great.
Folks, links to everything Joe and I have talked about throughout this episode, of course, will be in the show notes, so make sure you check those out. And folks, if you've enjoyed anything that you've heard here this evening or previous episodes of the Podcast Digest, quick little review in iTunes or Stitcher or soon to be Google Play Music would be greatly appreciated. So, folks, that'll do it for this episode of the Podcast Digest. Until next week, my name's Dan Lizette, and I will talk to you then.
Thank you for listening to the Podcast Digest. You can follow the show on Twitter @PodDigest. Like the show on Facebook at facebook.com/The Podcast Digest. Email the show feedback at thepodcastdigest@gmail.com. And you can find all the previous episodes and exclusive blog entries at the show's website, thepodcastdigest.info.